Hello there, and welcome to I've lost count. I'm just kidding. It's part 13 of our series, Experiencing God. If you had not been with us, we're talking about the central importance of experience in the Christian faith. It's how Christian faith started. People had an experience with God in the person of Jesus. It's how Jesus said Christian faith would roll on. We would continue to experience him spiritually through his Spirit, the Holy Spirit. Lots of people came into Christian faith because of a spiritual experience with Jesus. Many Christians can bear witness, can testify to experiences that they've had spiritually that have sustained their faith over time. And in our modern world, our skeptical world, where nothing passes for truth unless it can be observed and measured, or in our postmodern world where nothing's true or everything's true, it's getting harder and harder for a lot of Christian people to sustain healthy faith apart from tangible experience, direct personal experience. So this series really is about how to do that. How do we experience God? How do we recognize God in our lives, or the voice of the Spirit? How do we experience God? In this last part of the series, we're talking about things that we can do together, interpersonal practices that have a kind of otherworldly feel to them, edge about them, a sort of, people just don't do this sort of thing anymore, kind of spirit to them. Because they're so otherworldly, because they're so odd, at least as far as general culture is concerned, they're godly. They're places where you are likely to experience the presence of God. Last week, when we were together, we talked about experiencing God in the practice of confession, confessing our sins to one another and praying together that we might be healed. If you thought that was intimidating, today we're going to talk about the other half to that coin. We're going to talk about experiencing God through the practice of correction. Correction. You heard me correctly. Now, what do I mean by correction? Very simply, I mean holding one another accountable to a shared way of life. And that's important as we get started, because throughout this message, I'm going to use the phrase the church. And what I mean by the church is not church leadership, sort of in a kind of power dynamic down. I mean as a community of brothers and sisters, holding one another accountable to a shared way of life. Now, if that idea immediately strikes you as uncomfortable, if not entirely inappropriate, that would be a testament to how thoroughly the expressive individualism of modern Western culture has distorted, everything, but certainly Christianity. It's becoming truer and truer in general culture that there are no objective standards that we can hold one another accountable to. For the most part, lots of people now just accept it as assumptive truth that standards are purely internal, that what it means to be a human being is primarily psychological, it's internal, it's about how you feel and what you think and your own sort of internal world, and you set your own standards. And whatever your standards are the standards, and everybody is expected to sort of affirm and recognize and validate everyone's individual standards. That's how the world seems to be moving. But even amongst people who represent more of an old guard, people who acknowledge the idea of accountability in general, like there are still people who think or expect to be held accountable in their workplaces or on their teams, or still expect parents to hold their children accountable, right? So even amongst people who generally don't balk at the idea of there being standards that we can hold each other accountable to, even amongst them. When it comes to the arena of spirituality, the church, morality, and ethics, it seems like everybody operates under the basic assumption that how we appropriate our faith is a matter of pure personal choice. That no one's choice is better than anyone else's choice. You would never even think of, you could not imagine ever stepping into the life of another person and telling them that they shouldn't do a certain thing or that they should do a certain thing. And you are probably very reluctant to give anybody the right to do that in your life. It's as if we all assume that how we live our lives out there in the world as Christian people has no bearing on the church. And therefore, the church has no say in what we do or don't do. Of course, that way of thinking about church and Christian faith and morality and ethics would have made no sense to Jesus' first followers, or quite frankly, to the rest of church history, for that matter. When people started following Jesus, they understood that when they got baptized into Christ, they were getting baptized into a community of people who were already following Christ. There's only one way into a room like this, and it's through the witness of people who were already here. Christianity is something that you inherit. It's something that you receive. It's not something that you make up for yourself. There really is no such thing as your or my personal faith, somehow apart from or detached from the faith of the church, of the community. When you are baptized into Christ, you're baptized into a community of people who are already following Christ. No Christian on an island. And that basic fact that Christianity is something you inherit from a group of people, and when you become a Christian, you join that group of people that preceded you, that basic fact comes with, as much as we would like to try, some unavoidable entailments. Some unavoidable entailments. First, this already established community that shared with you the story about Jesus has a shared identity. It is a particular kind of community. This is who we are. We are people who pledge our primary allegiance to Jesus. That community has an identity that you step into. It isn't one that you create. You don't give them the identity. That identity already exists. It's a community with a shared identity. And like any gathering of people that has a shared sense of identity, the church also has a shared way of life, a shared moral vision, if you will. This is how we live because this is who we are. You step into a community that has an established identity with an established shared way of life. That is a way of life you have to learn from the community. Every Christian person has to learn how to follow Jesus from other people who are already following Jesus. When the Apostle Peter shared his first sermon in the book of Acts, the people who heard that sermon responded with a question. They said, "What should we do?" You see, Peter was already following Jesus. He knew what it meant to follow Jesus. They did not. They had to learn it from him and from the other people who had already been following Jesus. So the church has a shared identity. Because it has a shared identity, it has a shared moral vision, a way of life. This is who we are, and this is how we live because this is who we are. It is the church's responsibility, people who are already following Jesus, it is their responsibility to teach that way of life to other people and then to help them actually live in it. There's no other way that this thing rolls on down the road. Because you are part of a community, just like any other community that you're a part of, just like any other association, the way in which you live, and they understood this, the way they lived reflected, for better or worse, reflected on the community. To borrow a line from Herb Brooks in the movie The Miracle, they understood that the name on the front of the jersey is more important than the name on the back. That when they go out into the world, they represent the church. They represent all Jesus followers. So how they live is going to communicate to the world, this is what it means to follow Jesus. Why do so many people think the church is such an awful place? Well, because they probably know a handful of supposed Christians who are awful people. How we live our lives reflects on the church, for better or worse. And because of all of that, because when you are baptized into Christ, you enter a community of people who are already following Christ. That community has an established identity and an established shared moral vision, a way of life. It is the church's job to teach you that moral vision, to help you live in it. And how you live is a reflection on that community. Because of all of that, it is also the church's responsibility, and I should say authority or right, since we like that kind of language so much. It is also the church's responsibility to correct us when we get it wrong. How else will we continue over time to more closely align our lives with Jesus? Luck? How else does it happen other than when we get something wrong, a group of people come alongside of us and say, hey, let us help you with that. Correction. And again, we live in a world that is so utterly strange in the sense that simultaneously we correct everyone all the time about anything we don't like. Indiscriminately. We indiscriminately condemn people for everything, anything we want. And also, we indiscriminately affirm all things. It's a very strange world in which we live. We don't want anybody to correct or critique us, but we spend most of our lives correcting and critiquing everyone and everything all the time, with no real basis for adjudicating between anything, right? But even in arenas where we think, yeah, accountability is important, that's an important thing, we don't apply that to spirituality. We think we can come to church, we can hear the things, and then we can go out into the world and we can appropriate those things however we choose to appropriate them, and it's nobody's right to tell us otherwise. That is not how Jesus talked about the community of people who would follow him. In fact, in his most famous sermon, what we call the Sermon on the Mount, and I want you to think about the Sermon on the Mount as like the constitution of the Christian faith. Right? If Moses gave the people of Israel the 10 Commandments, if our lives as Americans are governed by this founding document that we call the Constitution, which we keep coming back to and talking about and interpreting and wrestling with and arguing over, the Sermon on the Mount is the constitution of the Christian church. It is like the founding document. It was a speech. It's a founding document for Jesus' early followers, for the early Christian community. This is who we are, and because this is who we are, this is how we will live. And of all the things that Jesus could have chosen to put in his constitution, he carved out a little section to talk about correction, to talk about correcting one another, which for any Christian person ought to be enough to convince you of just how significant this issue is in the life of the church. It's as if Jesus is saying, you cannot do Christian faith without correction. Let me read to you what he said. This comes to us from Matthew's gospel, Matthew's story about Jesus. This is in chapter 7. This is what it says. Do not judge others, and you will not be judged, for you will be treated as you treat others. The standard you use in judging is the standard by which you will be judged. And why worry about a speck in your friend's eye when you have a log in your own? How can you think of saying to your friend, let me help you get rid of that speck in your eye, when you can't see past the log in your own eye? Hypocrite, first get rid of the log in your own eye. Then you will see well enough to deal with the speck in your friend's eye. Don't waste what is holy on people who are unholy. Don't throw your pearls to pigs. They will trample the pearls, then turn and attack you. So the first thing that Jesus says is don't judge others, which seems to undercut this entire conversation. It sounds at first blush like what Jesus is saying is, it is no one's job to police anyone else. Don't judge other people and you won't be judged. But that's not what Jesus is getting at in the way that you and I think about it. When he says do not judge, think of final judgment. It's like he's saying something more like do not condemn. Do not write each other off. God is the only being who has the knowledge and the concern and the authority to pronounce final judgment on somebody. When Jesus says do not judge, what he's saying is do not condemn another person's soul. When you venture into the world of pronouncing final judgment or condemnation on another person, you are risking judgment and condemnation on yourself. The measure that you use will be measured to you. Okay? But that does not mean we are not supposed to help one another toward living more God-honoring lives. Jesus goes on to say, boy, if we can deal with the speck and plank stuff, then you can see clearly enough to be of help. So Jesus is not saying, do not help each other in this way. He's saying, do not condemn, right? Leave that up to God to offer final judgment. If the measure you use is to entrust God with final judgment in the hopes of mercy, then that's the measure that will be used against you. Okay? Jesus is then going to go on to say, how do we help one another? How do we help one another? And I think it's really instructive for us that he frames this whole thing using the language of sight. So, someone in the community is doing something he shouldn't do. Jesus describes that as him having some kind of obstructed vision. He has a speck of something in his eye, which both is keeping him from seeing the way that he ought to see, but because it's his eye, he can't see in it to deal with it effectively and to remove it. Why we do what we do has something to do with our moral vision, how we see things. This is the key reason why we need other people to help us. For instance, there are going to be times in your life where you are doing something you should not do, and you simply do not recognize it as wrong. Just because a person identifies as a Christian, says, I am a Christian person, goes to church, all the things, does not mean that they have adequately worked out the moral implications of their faith. It is very possible that you can say, I'm a Christian person, and you can go out into the world, and you can be doing things that it simply does not occur to you are incompatible with your faith, because you've never worked that out. Let me give you an example in my own life. As you can imagine, I have been corrected many times. One time, I was 17. I had been following Jesus for about a year. We were at a camp that summer. One afternoon, I was out on the basketball court shooting baskets by myself, and one of my leaders came over to join me. And after a few minutes, he said, hey, Mike, can I talk to you about something? I said, sure. What's up? And he proceeded to tell me that as a follower of Jesus, I needed to watch my mouth. You see, I used to cuss like a sailor, and that really didn't change much during the first year of me following Jesus, because it simply didn't occur to me that my faith in Jesus ought to be reflected in my manner of speech. I just did not myself put those things together. But here, one of my leaders stepped into my life and revealed to me that how we speak, the words that we use, have power. Words can lift up, they can tear down. Words can give life to people, breathe life into people, and they can also take it away. They can kill. There are words that are vulgar and profane, that don't help anyone in any way. They're not edifying. They don't do any good in anyone's life. He pointed out that Jesus never spoke the way that he often heard me speak, and that if a non-Christian person were to hear me talk, it would never occur to them that my life is governed by a different authority because I sound just like they do. He said, Mike, if you want to grow spiritually, if you want to grow up, you need to start dealing with how you speak. As Jesus' brother James would say, you have to tame the tongue. It was one of the most transformative moments of my life. It set me on a totally different course and trajectory, a better one. Right? It was a moment of correction. But it was because I just didn't know. I just didn't know. It would have taken, maybe I would have come to that conclusion at some point, but it would have taken me a long time. I just had not put together that because I'm a follower of Jesus, that ought to be reflected in my manner of speech. And I would have continued to speak the way I was speaking for a long time if somebody had not stepped into my life and said, listen, this isn't okay, you need to deal with this. Sometimes you're going to find yourself in that situation. Other times, there are going to be things in your life, you don't see them for what they are. It isn't that you haven't put it together in the same way as when I used foul language, but you just cannot see something truthfully for what it is. Let me give you another example. Several years later, I'm in college, I'm volunteering with a parachurch mission organization that works with high school kids, and our ministry is booming. I mean, it's exploding. It's busting at the seams. So hundreds and hundreds of kids are coming to our weekly gathering. I've got hundreds of kids signing up to go on our summer camp trip. We got people giving their lives to Jesus and growing in their faith. You know, as a 19, 20-year-old kid, that kind of made me feel like hot stuff. Like the reason that this thing is booming, well, it's because I'm good at it. I mean, this is because of me. This thing depends on me. I mean, I got to be everywhere and I got to do everything because I'm the attraction. If I'm not there, if I'm not doing the stuff, this thing's going to fall apart. Now, I never said that to anyone, but I certainly acted as if it were true. I could not see how driven by ego and pride I was. I just couldn't see it. But my mentor could. And that's almost always how it goes. What we cannot see in ourselves, other people see with crystal clarity. And as we sat at his kitchen table one afternoon, and he lovingly revealed to me what he saw in me, my pride and my arrogance, as he described to me how unbefitting that was for a Christian person, and how unhealthy, how spiritually destructive it was to my own soul and to the work that I was doing. I'm telling you, I don't know that I've had a more painful moment in my spiritual journey. I don't know that I have ever felt that vulnerable and exposed. But by God's grace, I received what he had to say. I mean, I knew he was right. And it changed my life. I experienced God in one of the most powerful ways I've ever experienced God. And it changed my life. It set me on a different course. I would not be here right now doing what I'm doing if it had not been for that moment of correction. So we are going to do things we should not do. And Jesus seems to describe that as we are all going to, at some times, we're going to have specks in our eyes. That it's going to obstruct our vision, it's going to keep us from living the way that we're supposed to live, and we are not going to be fit for different reasons to deal with it ourselves. We're going to need other people to help us. But when it comes to the issue of correction, this is what I think is so interesting. Jesus seems to be saying that as big a problem as that is, that you and I will have specks in our eyes and we'll sin and we'll do things that we shouldn't do, the bigger problem is actually the vision of the person seeking to be helpful. That yes, you are going to sin. You are going to have a speck in your eye at some point, and you will need someone to come alongside you and to help you with it. But I cannot emphasize this point enough. It seems like what Jesus is saying is that bigger than the fact that we sin in the church, a bigger issue than that. We sin, but for the integrity of personal faith, for the integrity of corporate faith and the church and the witness of the church in the world, what is more important than the fact that we sin is how we deal with one another in our sin. That is the bigger issue. How we see one another and how we deal with the specks in one another's eyes is a bigger issue, a bigger source of potential problem, right? Jesus says that for you to help another person with a speck in their eye, I want you to think about that. That's like precision surgery. Think about how difficult it is to do that, how careful you have to be to remove a speck from somebody's eye. How could you possibly do that if you have a gigantic plank sticking out of your own, obstructing your vision? You can't see clearly enough to get at, right, the other person's problem. Now, by plank in your eye, Jesus does not mean, well, you also have sin. If that's what Jesus meant, then none of us would be able to help each other with anything because we all have sin in our lives all the time. Again, this is about vision. It's about how we see. I think what Jesus is getting at is you are not fit to help someone with the stuff in their life if you can't see properly. If you don't see yourself properly, if you don't see them properly, if you don't see the nature of the problem properly, if you don't understand your role as a helper properly, all of that and other stuff is going to be like a gigantic plank of wood obstructing your vision. It's going to prevent you from being able to help the other person. I mean, Jesus is saying we have to help one another. We cannot be Christian people if we do not help one another. It's essential to Christian faith. But you cannot help another person if you are not super critical about your own sight and vision. You have to be way more self-critical than you are critical of another person. If you're super eager to, correct another person, it's probably not for you. Right? In both of the examples that I just gave you, the people who came to correct me, I loved them, I trusted and I respected them. They were mature in their faith. They came to me in private. They did it respectfully. And it was so evident in their posture, in their heart, in their tone, that they had taken time to really think about this and to get themselves into a place where they were going to do it in the right posture. Right? We cannot help each other. We need to help each other in order to be Christian. In order for the church to be a church, we have to hold each other accountable to the shared moral vision, the way of life of the church. We have to do that. If we don't do that, the church is nothing. But we can't do that if we are the kinds of people who don't see well, don't see God, ourselves, other people, the nature of sin, all of it. Right? So we have to be critical of ourselves before we can step into the role of helping. Of course, there's another side to the equation. There is the person being helped. Jesus goes on to say, don't give things that are holy to people who are unholy. Don't throw your pearls to pigs. Just because just because we might feel like we're in a good place or we're in a good posture to help another person, doesn't mean the other person's in a good place or in a good posture to receive the help. It is possible that a person isn't going to receive the help. They're not spiritually at a place where they're going to hear you. What they are going to do is what a pig would do with pearls. It has no use for pearls, so all it's going to do is attack the person offering them. So just as important as what needs to be said or how it needs to be said, just as important as all of that, or when or by whom, is what's the assessment of the person that we're seeking to help? Do we know them well enough to know how they're likely to receive what we have to give them? The people who came into my life in the two examples that I just gave you, Despite my arrogance and my vulgarity, they knew me well enough. They had spent enough time with me. They knew that I was the kind of person who genuinely wanted to be obedient to Jesus. So if they brought a word of correction into my life, I would hear it. I would listen and I would do something about it. And by God's grace, they were right. So we have to be an institution of people that help one another in this way. But we have to be the kinds of people who have the right posture to do it. We see appropriately to do it well. And we also have to be the kinds of people who are open to that happening in our lives. That we want to follow Jesus, and so if someone has some corrective word for us, we're going to receive it, because that's the thing we want most. Now listen, I know this is a big topic. I know I've left a ton on the table. We can't talk about all of it. I know this is incredibly scary. I know that you're probably sitting there and you've got all kinds of concerns. Like, what do we mean by shared moral vision? Are we talking about just the shared moral vision of this particular church or the church in general? And is that even a thing? Have Christians across space and time ever universally agreed on everything? And if not, well then who gets to establish the standards? Are power dynamics important? You know, what does it look like to correct someone that you're in a position of authority over or under or lateral or, those kinds of things? And of course, isn't the church supposed to be a place where we experience mercy and forgiveness? I mean, we're all failing to live up to the moral vision all the time. If we're all going around inspecting one another and correcting one another, isn't the church going to start feeling like some kind of a moral police state? Right? All of those concerns are incredibly valid, and it's why I think the way Jesus talks about it is so important. Jesus does not want his community of followers to feel like a moral police state. It's not how he ran things. It's not how he talked to people. It's not how he led his students. It's not what he wants the church to feel like. At the same time, the church is a community of people. It's a community of people with an established identity. We are a people who pledge our allegiance to be faithful and obedient to Jesus. That is who we are. And because that's who we are, there are certain things we do and don't do. There is a way of life that is consistent with that shared identity. You have to learn that way of life from other people. There is no other way for you to learn it except through people who have been doing it longer. And like it or not, the way that you live your life is a reflection on your brothers and sisters. When you go out into the world and you say things and you do things and you think things and you behave in certain ways and you send certain emails and you post certain things on social media, when you do those things and people know that you claim to be a Jesus follower and that you attend a church, it is a reflection on the rest of us, for better or worse. And because of that, the rest of us have the right, we have the authority in your life to come to you if there's something going on in your life that you don't see that needs correcting. That always needs to be done between people who know each other, love each other, trust and respect one another. And it is always, always, always for the purpose of helping. It is for the purpose of helping one another more closely align our lives with the Jesus we say we believe in and love and pledge our allegiance and devotion to. It's always for the purpose of helping one another. Between people who are all struggling to do it perfectly, that should always be the spirit and the posture of it. We do not need more of what the world has to offer. What broader culture is offering you is no standards to call anybody to, so that we're left indiscriminately condemning everyone for anything we happen to want to condemn them for, or indiscriminately affirming everything because someone simply claims that it ought to be. That world is confusing and disorienting. It's disintegrating. People don't know who they are anymore or how to live. The Christian church should not be a moral police state, but it ought to be a place where we say, that's who we're following. That particular God right there who goes by the name Jesus. We can look at his life, we can listen to what he says, and we say that's our standard. That's who we're trying to imitate. That's who we're trying to be faithful to. We are Christians, little Christs, little Jesuses. At least that's what we're aspiring to be. And because that is the objective standard that we are all pursuing together, our shared way of life based on our shared identity, the only way to get there, and we have this possibility because we have that standard, the only way to get there is for us, when necessary, to come alongside one another and say, listen, I see something in your life I don't think is truest of you. I don't think you are living into your true identity as a follower of Jesus, and I want to help you to deal with it. This is who we are, and this is how we live, because this is who we are, and you are a part of us. And so I want to help you live the way we live. Because our objective standard is Jesus, we can help one another in that way, and it's a better way. It is a better way than the world of sort of unbridled freedom and no standards and who knows what goes anymore that goes on in the broader culture. Sitting down with one another and lovingly correcting one another when it's necessary is something that people just do not do anymore. They don't do it anymore. Imagine a world where people loved each other enough to actually call each other to better things, and did that in loving ways. That when we saw sin in one another, we didn't treat each other like monsters, but that we receive one another and we help one another to get better. That is so countercultural, so scandalous, so otherworldly. People just do not do that sort of thing. If you were to commit to doing that in your life with someone you know and love and trust and respect, give them permission to do it in your life. Hopefully they give permission to you to do it in theirs. It is a place where you are certain to experience God. I know that practices like confession and correction are terrifying to most of you. And I know that most of you are not going to turn around tomorrow and start doing these things. I understand that. But my hope is that you'll see a wisdom in the faith community, in the Christian way of life. There's a wisdom there to help you to flourish as human persons. So maybe at some point, if you have somebody in your life who you love and you trust and you respect, and they're trying to follow Jesus, and you're trying to follow Jesus, maybe sit with one another and suggest giving each other permission to do this. And maybe you'll have a moment, either where you'll be in the seat of helping someone else or they'll be in the seat of helping you. Either way, what an amazing opportunity to dispense grace and mercy and togetherness and a commitment to something that's worthy of your life. People don't do that anymore. But those are the moments that God is in. So I hope at some point you'll take that step. Let me pray for us. God, we confess our sin to you, the sin that we see, the things that we know we've done, and also the things that have been left undone or things that we don't even see. We trust in your mercy and grace toward us. We want to more closely align our lives with you, and we thank you that you have given us a community of brothers and sisters who are trying to follow you too. That together we can all empty ourselves of pride and arrogance, and we can receive one another in love to help each other to grow up into mature faith, to more closely embody your son Jesus. Thank you that we can have that in a world that doesn't have that anymore. We're grateful. Pray that we would have the faith to take that step, lead us in that direction, and I pray that we would experience you in those moments. We love you. We trust you with our lives. We thank you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.